the ballot box, self-defense, revolutionary fervor on the grassroots leadership, and most importantly, Black nationalism. Well, what is Black nationalism? Well, according to Malcolm X, Black nationalism was the ability of African Americans to control the economics of our community, the politics of our community, the educational infrastructures of our community, the social and civic organizational and the business apparatuses of our community. Because what Malcolm X understood was even if you had the right to vote, even if you had citizenship, if you did not have these other institutional frames, you were not independent and thus you were not free. And Malcolm X was arguing that integration was insufficient to the needs of the Black community at that time. This is Malcolm Speaks. The great writer Lorraine Hansberry said she quit college to get an education of a different kind. So we're going to give you an education of a different kind today. So Malcolm X continues to live. He lives through us, his message, his ministry, his leadership. And so we're going to explore today one of his great orations, the last great oration he gave before he separated from the Nation of Islam. It was in Detroit, Michigan, November the 10th, 1963, 12 days before John F. Kennedy would be assassinated in Dallas, Texas. And we know that this would be a seminal event in Malcolm's separation permanently from the Nation of Islam. There were two historical great events that tremendously transformed and changed this country. One was the Great March on Washington, August 28th, 1963. Following the orders of Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X was allowed to attend, but he was not a participant. What he observed there set up what would come later in his message to the grassroots speech that he would give in King Solomon Baptist Church. But exactly 3 weeks after the march in Birmingham, Alabama, September 15th, 1963, 4 African-American girls would be killed by a bomb that was planted by a Klan member there, but more importantly was planted by the country. Because it was the country, the United States of America, that had set up that dastardly act, that had given them a sort of indirect permission to take umbrage and to continue to systemically kill African Americans. And it was in many ways the partying waters of what led Malcolm X to accept that his days in the Nation of Islam were numbered. So we go back to Detroit, November 10th. Why was Malcolm X there? Well, he had been invited by an organization called the Northern Grassroots Leadership. Why had they invited him? Because Michigan was becoming a hotbed of civil rights legislation and civil rights activism, and more importantly, civil rights agitation. And there was a mainstream African-American leadership group that was excluding those Black nationalists who were attempting to widen the discourse and to transform the political leadership throughout the country. As a result, they decided they were going to come up with their own organization, and they were going to come up with their own leadership movement there. And so they organized the Northern Grassroots Leadership. And that's when they invited Minister Malcolm X. He was given an invitation by Reverend Albert 𝗠𝗃𝗀𝗃 and a host of Milton Henry and a host of other African-American civic leaders in the city of Detroit. So when Malcolm came to King Solomon Baptist Church, there were 3,000 African-Americans who were there to hear him. And he would bring a salvo of great power, inspiration, insight that in many ways we've yet to hear since that fateful day almost 60 years ago. Well, what did he say? First of all, his speech was entitled Message to the Grassroots. And he began his speech by making it very clear that he was going to speak in a language that everybody could understand. He didn't believe in high pontification of language that was not accessible to working class people. The grassroots was a symbol of what he perceived to be the people who were being left out of the traditional civil rights movement. Malcolm X began his speech by citing historic revolutions that have taken place currently, but also historically. And so he cited 4 or 5 revolutionary models that African Americans should think about. They were, of course, the ongoing Great Cuban Revolution that began to culminate in the 1950s, and had taken place and was culminated with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara coming to lead the Communist Party into leadership positions of power in '59. He also would cite the Vietnam Revolution, which was just in many ways beginning. The Vietnam War had not reached its high point in American political infrastructure. He would cite the Bolshevik Revolution with Russia, 1917 through 1920s. And of course, he would cite the historic revolution of European Americans pretending to be white in this country in the 18th century. And he would begin to tell African Americans that there was no such thing as a nonviolent revolution. That is up for dispute, but Malcolm gave it his particular interpretation. And his particular interpretation was the following: that African Americans would only be liberated by having a bloodless revolution, but a revolution. He didn't believe that it could be nonviolent, but yet he said it would be bloodless and that would lead us to what he later would call the ballot or the bullet, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. On this particular day, keep in mind, Malcolm X does not know that he is working on just 1 month being in the Nation of Islam. He does not know that the President of the United States would be assassinated 12 days as a historic speech. So it's important when we listen to that speech that we not reimpose upon it what we know became historic events that would change our perceptions of it. What's important was that his speech was defined. His speech was informative. His speech was revolutionary. His speech got to the core of the African American experience and the multiplicity of that experience. And so Malcolm gave us a framework of what? The ballot box, self-defense, revolutionary fervor on the grassroots leadership, and most importantly, Black nationalism. Well, what is Black nationalism? Well, according to Malcolm X, Black nationalism was the ability of African Americans to control the economics of our community, the politics of our community, the educational infrastructures of our community, the social and civic organizational and the business apparatuses of our community. Because what Malcolm X understood was even if you had the right to vote, even if you had citizenship, if you did not have these other institutional frames, you were not independent and thus you were not free. And Malcolm X was arguing that integration was insufficient to the needs of the Black community at that time. And I would argue to this time, but let's stick to 1963. Malcolm X arrived in Detroit. Keep in mind that Malcolm X had been raised in many ways close to Detroit and Lansing, Michigan. Detroit was not a new place for Malcolm X. When he was released from prison, it was in Detroit that he was released to. And he spent 5 to 6 years going back and forth to Detroit doing leadership. It was in Detroit that he was made an assistant temple minister. At that time, they were called temples. They later would become mosques. Malcolm X knew Detroit. He knew the working class community. Also keep in mind that Detroit was the very central place of the labor movement of African Americans because of the car industry and the relationship that African Americans had to the car industry and the role that it played in the Great Migration. So Malcolm was speaking to a unique audience, an audience that was no longer willing to wait, an audience that was not as open and congenial to nonviolence. He was speaking to an audience that was ready for a revolutionary movement and revolutionary message. And so we're going to close here right now. We're going to come back with part 2 of our exploration of message from the grassroots. This is Malcolm Speaks.